is a fact, not very commonly known, but nonetheless a fact, that C.S. Lewis is one of the great philosophers. He's very much like Boethius in this. And by that I don't mean primarily that he has a similar philosophy to Boethius, though that is very much the case. What I mean is that he's a great philosopher like Boethius is a great philosopher. So before I say anything about Plato's Republic and C.S. Lewis's science fiction, let's talk about Boethius for a moment. The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius is a great book containing possibly a grand total of 0 original thoughts. What the Consolation does is it borrows, or better yet, transmits certain good thoughts from Epicurus, and more so the Stoics, and even more so Aristotle, Cicero, and the Platonists, and especially Augustine. And I don't think there's a single original thought in the whole book. Or if there is, I just haven't noticed it. It's all borrowed from earlier thinkers. And Boethius wasn't trying to do original thoughts. He was trying to have some good thoughts. And he did manage to present them in a highly original way. So what Boethius does is he takes the old thoughts and transmits them in a very new way, which helped to create an entire civilization. For like 1,000 years, the Consolation of Philosophy was the book anyone read who could read in Latin, as C.S. Lewis points out in his book, The Discarded Image. So it's a very important book of philosophy and literature and culture with few or no original thoughts at all. And that's the kind of philosopher Boethius is. Not an original thinker, but a conveyor, a preserver of old thoughts who presents them in a new way. He's a teacher of the old thoughts with little regard for originality, but with a very high regard for truth and wisdom, very much like Screwtape says we should not have a regard for in the Screwtape Letters, also by Lewis. So, back to Lewis. Lewis has few, if any, original thoughts. His thoughts are borrowed from church fathers, from Confucius, from Kant and Locke, at least sometimes, more often from Aristotle or Aquinas or Plato, or especially Boethius, and I think above all, Augustine. C.S. Lewis is, like Boethius, borrowing from Augustine and borrowing from Boethius. And very few original thoughts, if any, occur in his work, but he transmits them in a highly original way, and in a very good way, expressing better than anyone I can think of really challenging ideas from the likes of Plato or Augustine, but expressing them in ordinary language such that ordinary human beings can read this and not understand, not realize that they just deciphered Plato's Republic. It's spectacular what Lewis does with these old thoughts and how well he conveys them. And he may have even outdone Boethius in this regard. Also in having more books like this. The Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, The Abolition of Man, The Great Divorce, and even his Chronicles of Narnia and science fiction. He may be a greater philosopher than Boethius, and a great philosopher in much the same way. Now, enough of this babbling about Lewis and Boethius. Let's talk about Lewis and Republic. I'll try to keep this brief. The first book of C.S. Lewis' space trilogy, called Out of the Silent Planet, has this charming little passage, which is a pretty clear reference to an early passage in Plato's Republic. And out of the Silent Planet, Ransom, the man, the human, is visiting Mars, or Malacandra, which, as it turns out, is an unfallen planet, a planet unbroken, a planet without sin. And he's talking to the Hrassa, and specifically to one Hross in particular. Incidentally, the Hross can't say man as you or I might say it. They say man. They put an H sound in front of the man, in front of the M in man. So Ransom is trying to figure out why the Hrassa don't have any wars. And he asks his Hross friend, one Hross, two or more Hrassa, that's how the noun is used. He asks he's questioning his Hross friend about why they don't have wars. And he tries to explain to the Hross why humans have wars, and an effort to get the Hross to explain why the Hrassa don't have wars. And he says to the Hross, is not the begetting of children a pleasure for your kind? And the Hross says, a very great pleasure, man. And Ransom then explains, well, normally people indulge in that pleasure and then they have lots of children, and then they have too many people for their own community, their own land, their own resources, and so they feel the need to go and conquer land of neighboring peoples, neighboring families, neighboring tribes, take their land, take their resources, so that they can, so that they can have all the pleasures they want, and so that they can have all the, so that they can deal with all the effects of these pleasures. And the Hras doesn't see the point. He replies, yes, it's a very great pleasure, but we don't do it more than we need to. We only indulge in a pleasure as much as it's useful and proper and beneficial. And Ransom is astonished, or at least puzzled by this. And it's because Ransom comes from a fallen, sinful planet where our desires are all out of control. Lewis, like Augustine, can be understood very well according to this paradigm of rightly ordered loves, disordered desires, reordered loves, reordered desires. That would be as good a candidate as any for a one-sentence summary of both Augustine and Lewis, and to a very large extent the consolation by Boethius. So, the theme of disordered and reordered desires also occurs in Plato's Republic. And in an early passage of the Republic, Socrates has described what he considers to be a good community, where the people enjoy a few physical pleasures, but they keep it all under control. They eat acorns for pleasure. They enjoy sex with one another, but they don't overdo it, and so on. They don't need donuts. They don't need prostitutes. They don't need drugs. Their desires are all under control. And Socrates thinks this is a very fine city, and he describes this city, or maybe it's more of a small community than a city. He describes this city in these virtuous terms according to the nobility, the propriety of their existence. And he describes this city as a city where they do have physical pleasures, but it's all kept under control. And Socrates is talking with Glaucon and Adeimantus. And when they hear about the acorns, they get upset. And they say, this is a city for pigs, Socrates. A real city ought to have more pleasures than this. And then Socrates describes the origins of war in disorderly desires. And he says, okay, sure. He yields to Glaucon and Adeimantus. And Socrates explains, well, okay then, they will have to have more pleasures. And he goes on to explain how they acquire pastries and prostitutes and so on. And eventually this city, in its disorderly desire and its immoderation, has to grow and expand and has to go to war and take resources from other communities. And this explanation of war is exactly what Ransom uses, and what C.S. Lewis has done in Malacandra. And quite intentionally, and I think in this passage even explicitly, he's taken what is a thought experiment from Plato of a human community with its desires under control, and he has given it life in a science fiction story. And it's very cool. Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis.